Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to session 6. I'm Nandini. I'm a faculty from Purdue University and also a member of the ACM SIGGRAPH Education Committee. So, in this session, I welcome Rochele Gloor from the School of Visual Arts and Richard Thompson from NJIT. So, we are here to, listen more about their presentations on works of co-embodiment and also talking about democratization and character animation. So with that, I'd like to have Rochele Gloor take on the floor. And for the audience, we will have a Q&A session after the presenters present their work. So keep a lookout on the chat as well as the Q&A channels, and that's where you'll be typing in your questions. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nandini, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you so much for having me sharing my work. I am Assistant Director for Innovation Technologies in the MFA Computer Arts Department for the School of Visual Arts. And I'm going to talk about One Body, Four Minds, virtual multi-person co-embodiment in a shared 3D body, which is a method and also research that I started in 2024. But before that, maybe I'm just going to share a little bit of background on why I developed this. So I started in 2021 to just explore motion capture for embodiment, to analyze my body movements, and also to make sense of what is to be embodied in the artificial body, in the 3D avatar. And then now my role is to mentor and guide faculty and students on using motion capture for especially 3D character animation, but also for experimental arts to kind of like broaden their horizons. One thing that I think is very important is that embodiment is felt through the body. So I believe that putting on equipment enhance the feeling of the sense of embodiment and the learning technology. So I teach a class. We have a one semester course that every first semester student is required to take. And then I teach the motion capture class for that class. Is a 3-hour class, which is divided within theory and practice. So during the practice, I share the class into two. So it's kind of like from 22 to 25 students in each section to experience motion capture. So, and then having that in mind, that I understand how important it is to experience and have that experiential learning, I thought about like, how can I scale this in a more like fun, collaborative way? So I come up with this idea of, it's a new method where up to 4 people can share motion capture equipment and see themselves in real time, embodied in one 3D character in a real engine. And one of the reasons is the scalability of the practice, as I mentioned, but also, my own artistic exploration. And then later on, I did a research that I presented at EVA London last year. So I spent it on virtual co-embodiment from Rebecca Freeberg. And then this is kind of like the study technology that goes in. So we use Rococo motion capture. And for this, I use Unreal Engine 5.5, a 3D human-like with 52 blend shapes, 2 computer monitors, projection in the motion capture lab, and also facial capture, 2 gloves, and 1 bodysuit. I'm just gonna kind of go fast. And then also this is the Rococo interface on the left, and then on the right, the Xenia, that's the name of the character. You might know it's a 52 blend shape character. I didn't have time to create one, so this is the full kind of like study environment. So I have 1 body participant. I have 2 other participants wearing gloves. and a face participant, which is detached. They see themselves also projected in a big screen, and also there's another screen on the side that can show a video. I'll explain a little. So I divided the tasks in 4. And then the first one was just a mindfulness practice, so that they could have that awareness of what was happening and which kind of control each one had. And then the task 2, I'm just going to skip the task 1, but for the task 2, I found a TED Talk, that's Wendy Suzuki. And I think that TED Talk is a really good way to start thinking about it, because there's not too much movement, but there's a lot of like facial expressions and hand expressions. So they had to kind of like intuitively just try to mimic what Wendy Suzuki was doing in the film, and there was no practice beforehand. And especially like try to mimic what she's saying is really interesting. So that was kind of like a third preparation. And then we would do more than once if they wanted, but that was kind of like a long video, like a 10-minute video. So we do have there are 4 students working together. Like you don't see that the one that's wearing the face there, because like having the cable attached to the glove, it's a limitation. So there are certain movements that they cannot do. They cannot spin very fast, for example. But I believe that working with restrictions is also good for creative practice and problem solving. And then moving to a creative approach. So they had to come up with like, what is that I'm recording, create a mini story. And they were able to do that very fast. And then you can see on the left, they can see themselves embodied in that character. And the other one is talking to them about what's happening. So it's kind of like participating and creating on the fly. And then another one here. So the person with the with the face capture is sitting down. And they were kind of like carrying this heavy rock. But one thing that was really cool to see happening here is that they were, they were carrying this heavy rock, and then you see the student on the right, after they dropped the rock, she kind of like, put her hand on, and she is the hand, it's like, it's really hard to understand that sentiment of like shared control. And she did that as kind of like how we see in cartoons. So, of course, like I moved into a focus group practice. I've done this, like around 150 people have already either observed, because I think the observant is also very important to it. And then during the focus group, we talked about what was, and then some very interesting things that I noticed is that, the localized, the fragmented embodiment, it's more collaborative in terms of support of the task. That there was an hierarchy of like who would have more control, or who would take over the story. But never with aggressiveness. Everything was like, there was a communication, but there was a clear point of like who was controlling. And also like when you have the full body control, which is like the person who wears a suit, has a heightened sense of embodiment, but they have a conflict. So because their control is more fragmented, because they don't have the hands, and they want to act with the hand as if they were also. So it was really interesting to analyze. And then it's kind of like a way for me to think about, different ways to approach teaching. I believe that collaboration and then exploration, and this like experiential learning is very important. Also, like touching the equipment and understanding how to solve problems. Because, when you work with motion capture, there's always a problem to be solved. So it was very rewarding to work doing this. And then, I have some future plannings, but I'm going to stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle. That's very inspiring. And next we have our presentation from Richard, followed by the Q&A. Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me? All right. Thank you, Rochelle. That was great. And I can see why we were maybe paired together a little bit. All right, so I'm going to talk about some technology and sort of teaching that piloted starting last spring and then took it into the fall as well. So animating the clown, democratizing authentic character movement through AI-driven motion capture. And I just want to give a shout out to student Nova Kruger, whose alien clown this is pictured right here. And just so, hold on, there we go. A little background on me. Yes, I used to be a professional actor many, many years ago. And I am now about to release, at least to the film festival circuit, an animated film with an amalgam clown as my main character. I will be discussing the two platforms that we piloted this past year. One is now Autodesk Flow. It used to be called Wonder Dynamics or Wonder Studio. And Movin Tracing, which is a startup in Korea, which uses LiDAR technology, but machine learning. So for the students, the most important thing is to get them to the motion capture as quickly as possible so they can have time to experiment. But it's important that for me anyway, that they're using their own original characters. So we focused a lot on stylized design for the following reasons: get away from the uncanny valley, steer away from things that can be created by text to video, by focusing on actor intent, storytelling, visual storytelling, and design skills. And then the other thing is also the time for production, right? So if you go with something that's really photorealistic, it might seem much simpler in pre-production, but it's going to be exponential in terms of the time to create this and jeopardizing the possibility of achieving the final product, while a stylized design actually it might take a little bit longer in terms of sort of developing the design, but it teaches design techniques, and then it's actually more achievable. The end product is more achievable. So those are the reasons for stylized design. We talked a lot about the difference between authenticity and accuracy. Now, and all we're looking for is authenticity. And one of the best slides I ever demonstrated to students at the beginning of the class is this one. I showed a full facial rig, and then I showed them the amount of target shapes that were involved in that facial shape. And that really affected their designs once they saw that, which was really helpful, I think. And I also use a bunch of custom scaffolded video series that I've created that sort of step the student through the foundational technical aspects so that they can achieve, but it shouldn't conflict with their own creativity and originality. So why clowns? Well, there's a long history, as I'm sure many of you know, of a connection between sort of the history of clowning and animation, present day animation. So Commedia dell'arte with its stock characters, which can be seen in modern cartoons, leading that and also influence British pantomime, which was silent and everything had to be done with movement, which gave us Charlie Chaplin in silent movies, came from British pantomime. And Disney used Charlie Chaplin as a reference for his animators. And now we have Bill Irwin, who in his 70s is still being used for motion capture, which I thought was kind of interesting in terms of the clowning aspect of the physicality. So this is a quote that I like. Obviously, I think we're all aware of the tools are available as never before, and that they will continue to be so. And so it's just trying to stay on top of them. So I had an inertia-based motion capture, Xsense, starter suit, and I had played around with that, but it's really not scalable in terms of, especially with sort of constraints in terms of funding. And you have to deal with hygiene and cleaning the suits, even if it's just a t-shirt. And also just the processing is incredibly pricey. Um, so I played around with what was then Wonder Dynamics, and as you can see, amazing acting performance, which is then translated into one of their characters. But again, markerless, simple iPhone camera in one of my rooms at home. But it can also develop into an FBX, which can then be placed onto a character. So I started to experiment in my own creative work and research in terms of using it for that, and then you can see how it developed. Now, is there retargeting involved in cleaning up? Absolutely. We can talk about that maybe in the discussion afterwards. I had a student who I mentored over the summer with a URI, what we call a undergraduate research and innovation fellowship. And that's Carolyn Toledo, and they actually compared the two platforms. I mean, in terms of the inertia-based versus Flow Studio, which is AI-driven based. However, from that first pilot, we had really wonderful results, student results. And so this was a pilot of a studio I taught to our second year students. One of the students even completed an entire animation short, and which I recommended that they put up for consideration for MetroCAF, and it got screened there. And so that was a real feather in that student's cap, Gio Croco. I put the QR codes here of student work. You may not have time to get it. That's fine. If anyone wants, I can return to this slide. Now, in the fall, because many of our upper class students hadn't had access to the technology, but they had seen the results, many of them registered for an elective that I created called Digital Clowns. And but it was only an elective as opposed to a studio. And this time I wanted to pilot a newer technology that I had got, which was the LiDAR camera and machine learning. So the students posed as their characters, and then we rendered their clown characters, which, as you can see, are very radically different from each other, even though they followed much of my videos. They obviously animated their cameras as well, but I just want to point out that they were, I mean, universally thrilled with what they did in that course. They enjoyed it, and here's another QR code, which I will be happy to return to if people need it. And then I just, where we're going with this is that the LiDAR allows for real-time streaming, which is exciting. We're working with the theater department here. So I've got two students, again, Gio Kroko and Dasha Kozlenko, who are starting to work with one of their characters right now, live streaming it. And the idea is that they're going to interact their characters with live actors on stage in the spring for Curtains, which is they're going to be doing the musical. So that's still in development. And finally, both platforms, after I shared the student results, reached out to me to see if there was any potential for collaboration. And that's it.
This is so amazing. Thank you, Richard. I think we had two very nice presentations, and now is the time for the audience to use the Q&A channel to ask your questions. And I think I'll start asking a few questions while the audience, type in. So my first question is for Rochele, and I wanted you to talk more about the fragmented embodiment aspect and how the initial tasks help the students kind of get into the mode of empathy, and if you can talk more about that initial preparation to get into this fragmented embodied state.
Yeah, what I see is that even if you allow someone to wear all the equipment, like one person without sharing, it takes time for the person to understand how to act for motion capture, what's happening with their bodies. And one very important aspect that I notice is that they shouldn't lose that kind of maybe shyness and repressive way that they cannot like express themselves. So everybody becomes very expressive because they are placing themselves in this other, being that's not me anymore. So I think that even if you're, by yourself, representing yourself in the 3D character, there is that time that takes for you to understand what's happening. And I think that when the fragmented part it's even more difficult because and I heard one of the students say, I'm not an embodied person. And I thought that was fantastic. Uh, Even though he was one of my main focus group when I was developing the technology behind and the tasks. So it is difficult for people to be expressive and to also understand what's happening in the screen, and especially when the hand movement is fragmented, because we unless one it's considering that there's just a hand showing in the screen and that's what you are supposed to do. You are just supposed to work with the hand, which there's like a few artists that do, hand kind of video art. It takes time for you to know that you are not part of the body. So I feel that, like starting with a mindfulness practice, for me, it's always good for any type of, performance or any type of learning. So that was very nice because I didn't show the video, but it was a very slow movement. And then I would ask people to kind of like mimic what I was doing with their whole bodies. And then I would ask them to pay attention to the part that they were controlling in the screen, like that, like very directly, pay attention to the left, to the right hand, to the left hand. And then even that, like what is right and what is left, are you mirrored? And sometimes when they were like, they were mimicking Pulp Fiction, the scene of the dance scene. And then the person who had the body kind of like, okay, let's think that you have the right hand, so you're gonna follow the hand that I see on my right. And so they had to enter an agreement also on that part because she was controlling the body, right? She was not controlling the hand. So whoever had the hand had to come up and decide whether or not that would work for them. And it's really hard to understand also to see your hand on the other side and try to mimic that. And then another point was that the person who wears the suit, it's the most difficult one to detach from the hand. And it's the one that ended up like with more fragmented detail. And I believe that, we can look at people who have lost limbs and how they still like believe that the limb is there. So I think there's something like very rooted in our brains that don't let us detach from that. And then I think it would require more intention from the person to try to let go of that. And it's also kind of like, our body is so dynamic that when we move, the torso, we might move the leg. And it's kind of like it requires a lot of intention and awareness and presence in order to, work with the systems in this way. And then that's kind of like one of the things that I wanted to bring to them, like to understand spatial awareness. These are all, most of them are, they do VR, they create in 3D, and that they want to do immersive experiences. I think that understanding your physical space within also a virtual space is very important.
And just continuing on that, you had examples where students were lifting a rock, and then you mentioned they had to enact like a scene from another film. So, did you find different levels of difficulties and whether any differences in learning coming out of those scenarios?
I I definitely letting them explore and be creative was the most rewarding, was the one that I think that the action came up more natural. No doubt, by just like remembering like all the ones that we did this specific practice, that was yeah, the most natural for them, which was it was quite remarkable, especially thinking that the person who had the hand, the hands were so participating in the development of that story. And because it's almost like, okay, I am it, and that's a very good point to think that this types of fragmented frameworks can be very good at like exploring team dynamics and collaboration, because when they have to fulfill a task, it doesn't matter what is the role, they're gonna try to act the best in order to to have that story the way that each one was envisioning, even though they had shared what they're going to do, but not in specific detail. And those things just came naturally to them. So I think that the creative part was definitely the easiest one. The following a video was quite difficult because, and also I think Richard also mentioned something like that, because if you don't have the human, the avatar retargeted perfectly, and with like editing, and it becomes weird, like the arms want to get in the body, and then you're not really like natural just with your body reaction, because you kind of have to account for whatever feedback you're having. And then at a certain point, just looking at the Rococo interface, which is that kind of like very cute type of skeleton, in some point turns out to be better, because you can also have the facial expressions not as good as in Unreal Engine, of course. But so that was like limiting, having an uncanny a human-like form, but I did that on purpose because I wanted to see how they would react to it. And that was weird. And then they didn't feel as comfortable. They feel that there was something distracting them from the action. So we did a comparison with like just having the big projection with the Rococo skeleton and with the Unreal Engine. So yeah, the skeleton was better.
Yeah, it's very interesting to know the process of how you develop the project. And I think there's a parallel question for Richard. So I think talking about the facial retargeting, you mentioned pantomimes and the clowning aspects. So how did students learn to like retarget those clowning kind of nuances into the mocap avatar?
So that's a great question. It was actually we were especially with the elective, which was the clown one, the version of doing this curriculum, and we were limited in terms of time, and so we structured a lot of things with that in mind. Unfortunately, one of the things that I would, if I ever ran the elective again, is to give more time for the motion capture in terms of just rehearsing it, working on it, seeing the results of it, going back and editing. I did that with a few students, but we were really limited in time. So it's one of the things that I would change or adjust next time around, give more time for that. I think that the students, we do have a acting fundamentals for animators course, which we're actually just presently now probably going to be moving it a little bit earlier in the students' 4 years, which I think will benefit the students greatly in terms of when they take on these type of tasks. Because as most of you know, many students who sit behind a computer want to sit behind a computer for 14 hours a day don't really want to get up on a stage and act. And so it is sometimes a little bit tough. But one of the things is you can show them And I actually talked to the Autodesk people about it because it takes 50 minutes for whatever clip that you load up for it to download and to see it, and then you're really only seeing the skeleton unless and do this. So it's sometimes hard to judge
Mm.
what result you're getting until after the fact. And so I actually had a meeting with them before this, and I said, is there any idea that you might work towards something which is like you can live stream your character and see it happening in real time, and in their platform. So in terms of the animation, some were definitely more successful than others in terms of the clowning aspect of it. One in particular, the one that I mean, there were several that were really good. But the I would suggest that you really need a performer, but I wanted the student, like you want I mean, in the best case scenario, you want Bill Irwin to be doing everything for everybody. But then that takes away the experience for the student. And I think it was really important for the student themselves to perform, to learn that, yeah, they could probably do a lot more exaggerating. They could probably do a lot more expression with their bodies. We tend to tense up. We tend to be, especially if you don't like being in front of people or in front of a camera. And so we stiffen up, which is like the worst thing in terms of an animation. So it's really about finding ways to sort of open them up and tell them, no, you can get away with much more in terms
Mhm.
of, especially when you're dealing with a stylized character, because we're unable to do like, unless you are Charlie Chaplin, we don't naturally do anticipation for movements. We don't naturally do we can't do squash and stretch other than what our bodies allow. And so that there's all those things that you can add on after the fact somewhat, but it's still that part of it is I would say challenging to me in terms of like turning a stylized character that's used motion capture, human motion capture, and making the animation itself more stylized, if that makes sense.
And I'm assuming these are humanoid characters. Has there been like any other experimentations, other anatomies you've tried
Are
for,
you asking me or Rochelle?
Richard? Yeah, and of course,
Okay.
Rochelle, please feel free to, also contribute. Yeah.
It has to be a biped character for both technologies right now. Um, so at least as far as I know, it has to be a biped character because that's what the skeleton is set up for, the different
Mm.
skeletons.
Yeah, and in your future work, Richard, you mentioned about the live action and real time. So would it be like one-to-one with a student working with an actor, or is it again like a team project? How do you envision it for the next
It's
session?
definitely a collaborative project. So this was under a grant, an internal grant within NJIT for
Mhm.
sort of a curricular grant specifically for connected with AI. And so we built in exploration sort of funding so students could explore and get paid for it. But it's really a collaboration with the theater department there. And I didn't really know, but we have a wonderful director of the theater program here, Courtney herself, and um, she really went full bore on it, and she was like, "We're gonna see if we can incorporate it into the musical." So she actually got references from the like I think 1950s musicals and stuff like that, where singers actually did interact with 2D animations.
Mhm.
And so we're using that as a basis. So we're going to see how. So the general. I'll try and keep this brief. The general idea is at least she wants us to actually show the technology and have an actor perform the character. The biped character will be projected and will be interacting, hopefully, with an actual actor on stage who's performing a dance or a routine or a song or something like that.
Mm.
So one of the possibilities for one of the scenes in Curtains is a character of a bottle on a shelf. And so when maybe the actor on stage throws something at the bottle on the shelf, and the bottle
Breaks.
character has to, yeah, jump around.
Mhm.
So I don't know. We don't know whether it's all going to work, but it's fun,
Mhm.
and it's a fun collaboration, and it sort of in a weird way brings me full circle because I'm now using sort of my technological knowledge and interests, and to my theatrical background.
Mhm. Cool. And I don't see any questions in the Q&A, and we have like another 10 minutes. So please, audience, please type your questions. And
Maybe can I,
yes,
sorry,
yeah.
so Richard, I love
I'm going
that.
to ask you a question.
Yeah. I really, yes. And I love how you come to explore motion capture from a character perspective. So you start with the character.
Mhm.
I think that's really cool. Uh, do you know La Mama in New York?
I know of La Mama, yes.
Yeah, so they have an experimental theater, and I have watched, and I'm gonna remember, I'm not now, but I'm gonna remember the name of the director who created this like XR experience where person could have a VR headset. There was like live actors, there was a character um, being projected, and it was kind of like multi-country at the same time. Was really, really impressive
Mm.
because everything was functioning. And also Alex Colomb in New York.
Hmm.
He's owner of Agile Lens, and
Mhm.
he's been developing digital theater, and he has done things like that. I have watched,
Okay.
and he might be someone nice to kind of like contact. He's super cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'm also like, always trying to move in more like in performance for performatic ways with
Mhm.
motion capture and character animation, and I think it's really awesome. I explore the more distorted bodies,
Hmm. Hmm.
by just like retargeting
Hmm.
properly, proper way. So now I'm working with one of my lab assistants to try to make to deform the body from a four-person perspective. So like having that move as the person with the hand moves.
Hmm.
But I really enjoy. And then I want to ask another question. So you mentioned you were talking about like the acting, and I think that's really important to understand acting, and like how much you think that like animators should have a little more awareness of how to act, and do you think that would make them better animators by knowing to act
100%.
themselves?
100%. I mean, so I always encourage students, again, you run into the challenge where there are the students who are going to be fantastic digital animators or whatever, but they don't want to get out, they don't want, they're resistant to, which is perfectly natural. But I do encourage it. I mean, I think that when I came from the acting background, and I started learning Maya, back in the beginning of 2000 or 2001. And I think that just having had not the quality of the acting, but just the experience of rehearsal and what makes something funny. Not that I'm a comedian, but in terms of the physicality and everything like that, and the sense of timing. So timing cannot be taught. Timing can only be learned from experience. Or, I mean, there are people who naturally have inept, I mean, inert, I mean, a sense of timing. But I think that acting is really important. I think so. So, I mean, maybe I'm going to be getting on my little pedestal here to give my speech, but I think particularly in this time with I think at least the way I talk to my students in terms of preparing them is that it's even more and more important for them to realize how important it is to bring humanity to their work, to bring empathy to their work, to bring humanness, if you will, um, and to know how to tell a great story. Because right now, at least, you know, I'm not saying they're not going to solve this issue, but the some of the stuff that I've seen, it just like it lacks, in terms of the AI stuff, it lacks emotion, it lacks a truth to it that we can empathize with. And so I feel like if there's anything that I can help direct my students to is towards, let's focus on what makes your audience empathize with the character. And we need emotion, we need real emotion, we need exaggerated emotion, and everything like that. So yes, back to your initial question, yes, acting certainly helps. It's sometimes challenging with the type of students who are in this field. That's all. It can be challenging. Not that they're not willing, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, Rochele?
Yes.
So first of all, just a comment. I mean, I had so many thoughts when you were talking. I mean, I just the fragmented embodiment I think is so cool because I mean, I'm sure you're aware of like all the improv acting exercises that do that kind of like mirroring of someone else and not allowing someone like your scene partner to have like any scene partner to have control of the scene. So I thought that was, I mean, that can also was fascinating. I mean, I don't want to make it less of it, but I mean, people who are familiar with Whose Line Is It Anyway, they have a whole one of their improv skits is someone with their hands through the other person's armpits, and the person goes behind like this, and so they enact an entire scene, but one actor has control of the hands of the character and the other person. So that's what a lot of, I mean, it kind of reminded me. So I thought that was fascinating. I know you've touched on it a little bit, but I was wondering, is there anything that you particularly want to explore further, beyond this that you can share with us?
Yeah, because I'm working with students who, as you just mentioned also that not everybody it's expressive, not everybody is naturally understanding of how to act. And of course, some people are gonna be good by learning, by practicing. But I want to move and work with dancers or people in the theater. But I don't really know any theater people in New York, but I know dancers, lots of them. So and I think those are people that are very aware of their bodies, of the movement, of their space. And I think that would be really interesting. And then to kind of like create more like abstraction scenes where it is
Mhm.
interactive and not only like character based,
Mhm.
but character with deformation. I would like to explore that. But
Mhm.
having those four people who are like super aware of their bodies and the space, doing it and driving it,
Yeah.
I think that'll
Oh,
be.
that's fascinating. Yeah. Thank
Okay,
you.
we have another 3 minutes, and there's a question for Richard from Damien from the audience.
Mhm.
How much time do you allot for character modeling creation versus the animation mocap in a semester? Does
Yeah.
this span multiple classes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Terrific question. Again, so what I found over the years is that e- uh, long story short is I do, I've spoken about this, I think even at the symposium in previous years, is I do provide creative limits to the students because students, particularly coming in, what's wonderful about this field that I found is that the students are incredibly ambitious, right? But they also are unaware of the time that it takes to do something. Or they think that they're, in their first 2 weeks, they're going to do an entire Pixar short, by pressing a few buttons and because they want it. And it's fabulous, but you find yourself, sort of, no, let's slow down a little bit and everything. So what I do is the tutorial videos have found to be well, very productive in terms of, so for instance, let's say with the character, sorry, I have to let my dog out, but I'm going to just move as I talk. Is the So for instance, for the body modeling, I create videos that does a sort of a template which teaches them the sort of optimum topology for any biped and I show them how that same topology can make completely different character body shapes, exactly the same edge loops. So that frees them up. They can follow my videos. And then, yeah, there might be a little bit of customization, but they're not doing my character, they're doing their character, but using correct topology. So the videos, sort of the scaffolded videos, step by step, helps them get through that foundational thing, but also helps them to create their own design, right? Yeah, so it can work. Now, I talk about all of the simplifications that they might want to think about. And so to answer your question, right now, so in that elective course, I gave them 4 weeks to model and texture their character. And then, because again, they were just following steps, and it wasn't like they had to create controls for the rigging because it was going to be HIK. The rigging really just, I think I gave 2 weeks, if that helps. The design stage was probably a week, I think. So in pre-production, I mean, we talked a lot about where to save time, like choices that you can make in terms of design in that first session. So that would be the workflow to get to the point of motion capture. I mean, the idea, and this is just from 20 years of doing this, is that the experience that I've had in terms of animating is that a lot of animation classes would, the student would they would model, they would rig, and then the night before they would animate. And so the whole purpose of this is to try and give the students as much time as possible for the animation part.
Well, thank you, Richard and Rochele. There is a comment from the audience, which I'll post it in the general channel so you can follow up there. But now it's time to wrap up the session and hand over to Nick and Cheryl. So thank you again.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you very much.
Great session. Thank you.